There's a moment when the truth hits you so hard, your body shuts down. Your hands go cold, your chest locks up, and the room you're standing in, no matter how beautiful it is, starts to feel like a coffin. For me, that moment came inside a palace, a 400-year-old royal estate with gilded hallways, hand-painted ceilings, and servants who bowed every time I walked past. I was supposed to be a princess. That's what the world called me. The girl from a small village in rural Kenya who fell in love with a prince from one of Europe's oldest monarchies. The press called it a modern fairy tale. Magazines put my face on their covers. Little girls from Nairobi to London wrote me letters saying I gave them hope. I believed it too. I believed I was living proof that a girl with nothing could become something extraordinary. But that night, we alone in my husband's private study, with the door locked and my heart pounding in my ears, I wasn't extraordinary. I wasn't a princess. I was just a woman on her knees, trembling, holding a leather-bound journal that was never supposed to be in my hands. I had found it buried beneath a stack of documents in the bottom drawer of his desk. The lock on the drawer had been left open, almost like it was waiting for me. And when I opened that journal and started reading, every word hit me like a fist to the stomach. Page after page in my husband's handwriting, dates going back years. A woman's name I had never heard spoken in that palace. Details about a child, a little boy, already 4 years old, with my husband's blood running through his veins, and a last name carefully disguised to keep the secret buried. Prince Kasper. The man I had left my career for, the man I had crossed continents for, the man who held my face in his hands on our wedding day and whispered that I was his entire world. That man had an entire life I knew nothing about. And the worst part wasn't even the affair or the child. The worst part was that every single member of his family already knew. His mother, the Queen, who kissed my cheeks at Sunday dinners. His father, who gave a toast at our wedding, calling me a blessing to the family. His 2 sisters, who braided my hair and called me their blood. The palace advisors, the lawyers, the press secretaries, every single person who had shaken my hand, embraced me, and told me I was one of them, had looked me dead in the eye, knowing exactly what they were hiding. I sat on that cold marble floor for what felt like hours. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there, staring at the heavy velvet curtains with the journal open on my lap, asking myself one question. How did I get here? Because 5 years before that night, I didn't know what a state dinner looked like. I had never worn a dress worth more than my mother earned in a year. I had never been inside a limousine or walked a red carpet, or had someone address me as Your Highness. 5 years ago, I was standing in a cramped apartment in East London, rehearsing for a job interview, praying it would be the break I needed. And I got that break. I just didn't know it would eventually break me right back. This is my story, not the version the palace approved, not the one printed in the tabloids, the real one. And it starts in a place far away from thrones and crowns, on the dusty red roads of a Kenyan village, window with the smell of fresh mandazi frying at dawn, and a 17-year-old girl who made herself a promise she intended to keep. I grew up in a village so small that if you blinked while driving through it, you'd miss it entirely. It sat on the outskirts of Makueni County in eastern Kenya, a place where the earth was red and cracked during the dry season, and the rain, when it came, turned everything into a thick, slippery mud that clung to your ankles like it didn't want you to leave. Our house was a modest 2-bedroom structure with a corrugated iron roof that drummed so loud during storms, you had to shout to hear the person sitting next to you. My mother ran a small bakery out of the front room. It wasn't really a bakery by any formal standard. It was a wooden table, a charcoal stove, and a glass cabinet where she displayed mandazi, chapati, and occasionally sweetbread when she could afford the sugar. But to the people in our village, it was an institution. Every morning before sunrise, my mother would be up, hands deep in dough, humming hymns under her breath, while the rest of the world slept. I would sit on a stool in the corner, watching her work, mesmerized by how she turned simple ingredients into something that made people smile. She never complained. Not once. Even when business was slow and the flour was running out, and my father's salary as a groundskeeper at a nearby school barely covered our rent, she never let the weight of it show on her face. She would just knead harder, hum louder, and tell me the same thing she told me every single morning. Amara, God gave you a brain sharper than any knife in this kitchen. One day, you will use it to cut a path out of this place. My father was a quieter man. He showed his love not through words, but through sacrifice. He walked 8 kilometers to work every day in shoes held together with wire because he refused to spend money on himself when that money could go toward my school fees. I remember once, I must have been about 12. I came home crying because a girl at school had laughed at my uniform. It was faded and too short because I had grown 3 inches over the holidays, and we couldn't afford a new one. My father sat me down on the step outside our house, looked me in the eyes, and said something I carry with me to this day. He said, "Let them laugh, Amara. People who laugh at where you are have no idea where you're going." I wiped my tears and went back to school the next day with my chin up and my faded uniform pressed so crisp you could see the iron lines from across the classroom. Education was my oxygen. I was the kind of student who stayed behind after class to ask extra questions, who borrowed books from teachers because the school library had more dust than pages, who studied by candlelight when the power cut out, because in our village, the power cut out more often than it stayed on. By the time I sat my national exams at 17, I had spent nearly every waking hour preparing. I didn't just want to pass. I wanted to be undeniable. And when the results came, I was. Top of my district. One of the highest scores in the entire county. My mother cried so hard the neighbors came running, thinking something terrible had happened. But it was the opposite. Something extraordinary had just begun. The scholarship offer came from a university in London. When I opened the letter, my hands were shaking so badly my father had to read it aloud. Full tuition, accommodation, a monthly stipend. It was the kind of opportunity that didn't come to girls from villages like mine. It came to children from Nairobi's best private schools, children whose parents had connections and wealth and names that opened doors. But somehow, it came to me. My mother held my face in both hands and whispered, "You go, Amara. You go and you don't look back." I packed a single suitcase, wore the only pair of closed shoes I owned, and boarded a plane for the first time in my life. I remember pressing my forehead against the window as the plane lifted off, watching Kenya shrink beneath me, the brown and green patchwork of land getting smaller and smaller until it disappeared under the clouds. I cried silently the entire flight, not because I was scared, even though I was terrified, but because I knew that the girl sitting in that seat was carrying the dreams of every person she loved on her shoulders, and she could not afford to fail. London was a different universe. Everything moved too fast. People didn't greet strangers on the street. The cold cut through my clothes like they were made of paper. I remember standing outside my university dormitory on the first day, staring up at the gray sky, and wondering if I had made a terrible mistake. But I didn't have time for doubt. I buried my head in my books and worked harder than I had ever worked before. I took on part-time jobs in between lectures, cleaning offices in the early mornings, tutoring younger students in the evenings, and somehow still managing to sit in the front row of every class with my notes color-coded and my hand raised before anyone else's. By my final year, I graduated top of my class in international law. The girl from Makueni County, who once studied by candlelight in a house with a leaking roof, was now shaking hands with professors at one of the world's most prestigious universities. I landed a position at a respected law firm in the city, working on human rights cases that took me to places I had only seen in textbooks: Geneva, The Hague, Brussels. I was building a life my parents could be proud of, and every time I called my mother on the phone, I could hear it in her voice. That quiet, trembling pride of a woman who knew her daughter had done the impossible. And then, on a cool September evening in Geneva, at a diplomatic gala, I almost didn't attend because my shoes were pinching, and I had a case file waiting back at the hotel. I met him, Prince Kasper. And the life I had so carefully built with my own 2 hands was about to be rearranged by someone else's. The gala was held in a grand hall overlooking Lake Geneva. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls of light, and the room smelled of expensive perfume and old money. I was standing near the back, holding a glass of sparkling water because I never drank at work events, reviewing my notes on my phone for a case briefing the next morning. I wasn't there to socialize. I was there because my firm had been invited, and my senior partner had insisted I attend to make connections. I had done the polite rounds, shaken the necessary hands, smiled at the necessary people, and I was minutes away from slipping out the side door when a voice behind me said, "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else in the world right now." I turned around, and there he was. Tall, sandy-haired, seen with a jawline that looked like it had been carved out of Scandinavian granite. He was smiling at me, not the rehearsed kind of smile you see on diplomats and politicians, but a real one, the kind that reaches the eyes and makes you feel like you're the only person in a room full of hundreds. I almost laughed because he was right. I told him I had a case file calling my name and shoes that were slowly cutting off circulation to my toes. He looked down at my feet, looked back up at me, and said, "Then let's find you a chair before you lose them entirely." That was the first thing Prince Kasper ever said to me, and I had absolutely no idea who he was. We sat at a small table near the terrace for over 2 hours. He asked me about my work, and when I told him about the human rights case I was advising on, he didn't just nod politely the way most people did. He asked real questions, detailed questions. He wanted to know about the families affected, the legal frameworks involved, the obstacles we were facing. And then he asked me where I was from, and when I told him about my village in Makueni County, about my mother's bakery, and my father's 8-kilometer walk to work, he went quiet for a long moment and said, "That's the most extraordinary thing I've heard in this room tonight, and I've been here since 5 o'clock. There was no pretense with him, no arrogance, no name-dropping. He told me his name was Kasper, and that he worked in public affairs, which technically wasn't a lie, though it was an enormous understatement. When the gala ended and the hall began to empty, he asked for my number. I gave it to him without hesitation, which was unlike me because I never gave my number to men I had just met. But something about him felt different, safe, familiar, like a song you've never heard before, but somehow already know the words to. He called the next day, and the day after, and every single day for the next 3 weeks. We talked about everything: our childhoods, our fears, our ambitions, the kind of lives we wanted to build. He flew to London to take me to dinner at a small Italian restaurant in Covent Garden, not a 5-star spectacle, but a tiny candlelit place with checkered tablecloths and a waiter who called everyone darling. He remembered every detail I ever told him. When I mentioned once that my mother used to hum hymns while she baked, he found a recording of a Kenyan gospel choir and played it for me over the phone one night when I couldn't sleep. See, when I told him I missed the taste of mandazi, he tracked down a Kenyan restaurant in East London and had a box delivered to my office with a note that said, "Not as good as your mother's, but it's a start." I was falling in love with him faster than I had ever fallen for anything, and for the first time in my life, it wasn't because I was chasing something. It was because something had finally found me. It was on our 4th date that he told me the truth about who he was. We were walking along the South Bank after dinner, the Thames glittering black and gold beside us, and he stopped, took both my hands, and said he needed to tell me something important before we went any further. My stomach dropped because in my experience, when a man says he needs to tell you something, it's never good. But then he told me. He was Prince Kasper, the eldest son of a Scandinavian royal family, 4th in line to the throne. He watched my face carefully as the words sank in. I didn't speak for what felt like a full minute. I searched his face for some sign that he was joking, but his eyes were steady and serious and slightly terrified, like a man bracing himself to be walked away from. I didn't walk away. I asked him why he hadn't told me sooner, and he said because for the first time in his life, someone had liked him for who he was, not what he was, and he wasn't ready to let that go. I believed him. So I stayed. The months that followed were a blur of late-night phone calls, secret flights, and stolen weekends in cities across Europe where nobody recognized us. But eventually, the secret got out. A photographer caught us holding hands outside a cafe in Copenhagen. And within 24 hours, my face was on every tabloid in Scandinavia. The headlines were relentless. Who is the African girl with Prince Kasper? From a village in Kenya to a palace in Europe. The commoner who captured a prince. Some were kind, most were not, but Kasper held my hand through all of it and told me that none of it mattered because he had already made up his mind. 3 months later, on a quiet balcony overlooking the fjords, with the northern lights streaking green and violet across the sky, he got down on one knee and asked me to marry him. I said yes before he even finished the sentence. My mother screamed so loud on the phone that night, I thought she would wake the entire village. My father was silent for a long time and then said, "You see, Amara? So I told you they had no idea where you were going." The wedding was watched by 23 million people. I wore a gown that took a team of 12 6 months to create, hand-stitched with tiny beads that caught the cathedral light like scattered stars. As I walked down that aisle, I could see Kasper standing at the altar, tears streaming down his face. And I remember thinking, this is what it feels like when the universe finally says yes. Every sacrifice, every late night, every moment of loneliness and doubt, it had all led to this. My mother sat in the front row in a dress she had picked out herself from a shop in Nairobi, clutching my father's hand, and I could see her lips moving in silent prayer. I was no longer the girl from the dusty red roads. I was a princess, and I believed, with every fiber of my being, that the hardest part of my life was behind me. I had never been more wrong about anything. The first sign came on our honeymoon. We were staying at a private royal villa on the coast of southern France, the kind of place where the infinity pool melts into the horizon and the staff outnumber the guests 3-1. It was supposed to be 2 weeks of nothing but us. No cameras, no palace schedules, no obligations. Just Kasper and me, finally breathing after months of wedding madness. And for the first 3 days, it was perfect. We swam in the ocean at sunrise, cooked together in the villa's enormous kitchen, even though neither of us was particularly good at it, and stayed up late talking on the terrace with the sound of the Mediterranean lapping against the rocks below. I remember lying next to him on the third night, his arm draped across my waist, thinking that this was the safest I had ever felt in my entire life. But on the fourth morning, I woke up to an empty bed. I found Kasper on the balcony, pacing back and forth with his phone pressed hard against his ear. His voice was low and tense, almost a whisper, and the moment he saw me standing in the doorway, he ended the call immediately, not casually, abruptly, like someone who had just been caught. I asked him who it was, and he smiled, but it wasn't the smile I knew. It was tight around the edges, rehearsed, the kind of smile people give when they need you to stop asking questions. He said it was a palace advisor calling about a scheduling conflict and that it was nothing to worry about. I nodded because I had no reason not to believe him. He was my husband. We had been married for less than a week. Suspicion wasn't even a language I knew how to speak yet, but the calls kept coming. On the sixth day, he excused himself during lunch and disappeared into the bedroom for nearly 40 minutes. On the eighth day, I found him sitting in the villa's study at 2 a.m, his phone screen casting a blue glow across his face. When I asked why he was awake, he said he couldn't sleep and had been reading the news. But I noticed something in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. It wasn't guilt exactly, it was distance, like he was standing right in front of me, but his mind was somewhere I couldn't reach. I told myself I was overthinking it. I told myself that marrying into royalty came with responsibilities I wasn't used to, that late-night calls and strange schedules were just part of the job. I told myself that the man who had tracked down Mandazi for me in East London and played Kenyan gospel music over the phone to help me sleep was not the kind of man who would hide something from me. So I swallowed my doubt like a bitter pill and smiled through the rest of our honeymoon like nothing was wrong. When we returned to the palace, things only got worse. Kasper was constantly being pulled into meetings I wasn't invited to. Doors were closed before I could enter. Conversations stopped the moment I walked into a room. I noticed it first with his mother, the Queen. She had always been warm with me, or at least she performed warmth convincingly. But after the honeymoon, something shifted. She would look at me a beat too long during dinner, as if she was studying me, trying to measure how much I knew or didn't know. Or his younger sister, Elise, who had once been my closest ally in the family, started avoiding me. She would cancel our lunch plans at the last minute, always with the same vague excuse about being busy with charity work. Even the palace staff seemed different. The butler, who used to greet me with a cheerful, "Good morning, Your Highness," started averting his eyes when I passed. Small things. Things most people would dismiss. But I didn't grow up in a palace. I grew up in a village where you learned to read people's faces before they opened their mouths, because sometimes survival depended on knowing what someone was thinking before they said it out loud. And every face in that palace was telling me the same thing. They were hiding something. I tried talking to Kasper about it. I chose a quiet evening when we were alone in our quarters. I sat across from him and told him that something felt off, that I couldn't explain it, but the energy in the palace had shifted, and I felt like I was being kept on the outside of something important. He put his hand on mine, looked me in the eyes, and told me I was imagining things. He said the transition into royal life was overwhelming, and that it was natural for me to feel out of place at first. He said his family loved me, and that I needed to give myself time to settle in. His words were reassuring, but his hand was trembling. I looked down at his fingers resting on mine, and I could feel the faintest vibration, like a current running beneath his skin that he was trying desperately to keep hidden. He was afraid. I didn't know of what yet, but I knew, in that deep, wordless place where instinct lives, that my husband was carrying something heavy, and he was doing everything in his power to make sure I never found out what it was. The weeks turned into months, and I began to feel like a stranger in my own home. I would walk through those gilded hallways and catch glimpses of myself in the towering mirrors that lined the corridors, and I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. She looked like a princess. She wore silk and diamonds, and her hair was always immaculate, but her eyes were hollow. The light that had once burned so fiercely in them, the same light that had carried a girl from Makueni County to a London courtroom to a royal cathedral, was flickering. I started calling my mother more often, sometimes twice a day. She could hear it in my voice, that something was wrong. But I never told her what because I didn't have the words for it yet. How do you tell your mother, the woman who prayed over you every night and told you God had a plan, that the fairy tale she believed in might not be real? How do you break the heart of the woman who sacrificed everything so you could have this life? You don't. So I kept quiet. I smiled for the cameras. I attended the state dinners and the charity galas and the ribbon-cutting ceremonies. And every night, I lay awake in a bed that cost more than my mother's entire bakery, staring at the ceiling, feeling the cracks spreading beneath me like fault lines before an earthquake. I didn't know it yet, but the ground was about to open up and swallow me whole. It happened on a Tuesday evening in late November. I remember the day precisely because there was a state dinner scheduled for that night, and I had spent most of the afternoon being fitted for a new gown. Kasper had left early that morning for what he said was a meeting with foreign diplomats in the capital, but he had promised to be back by 6 to get ready together. By 7, he still hadn't returned. By 7:30, his phone was going straight to voicemail. The palace staff assured me he was on his way, but their eyes told a different story. I got dressed alone, attended the dinner alone, and smiled at 300 guests for 4 hours while my husband's chair sat empty beside me. The Queen made a brief apology on his behalf, something about an unexpected extension to the diplomatic meeting, and the guests nodded politely and moved on. But I saw the Queen exchange a look with Kasper's father across the table, quick and deliberate, the kind of look that carries an entire conversation in a single glance. I excused myself before dessert was served, claiming a headache, and walked back to our private quarters, with my heels echoing through the empty hallways like a countdown. Kasper didn't come home until well past midnight. I was sitting in the living room, still in my gown, the makeup I had spent an hour applying now smudged beneath my eyes. He walked in looking exhausted, his tie loosened, his hair disheveled, and when he saw me sitting there, he froze in the doorway like a man who had just walked into a trap he didn't see coming. I asked him where he had been. He gave me the same answer he always gave. The meeting ran late. Diplomatic complications. Nothing to worry about. But this time, his voice cracked on the last word. I stared at him for a long time, and he couldn't hold my gaze. He kissed my forehead, said he was tired, and went to bed. I stayed in that chair for another hour, listening to the silence of the palace pressing in around me like walls closing in. Something inside me shifted that night. The doubt I had been swallowing for months, the questions I had been burying to keep the peace, the instinct I had been ignoring because I was too afraid of what it might reveal. All of it rose to the surface and refused to go back down. I was done waiting for answers. I was going to find them myself. The next morning, Kasper left early again. I waited until his car pulled out of the palace gates, and then I did something I had never done before. I went into his private study. It was a room I rarely entered because Kasper had always treated it as his personal space, and I had respected that boundary the way I respected everything in that palace, quietly and without question. The room was immaculate. Dark oak bookshelves lined the walls, a heavy mahogany desk sat in the center, and the air smelled faintly of the sandalwood candle he liked to burn while he worked. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for. I just knew that whatever Kasper was hiding, traces of it would be in this room. I started with the desk drawers. The first two were unlocked and contained nothing unusual. Palace correspondence, official documents, a collection of monogrammed pens. But the third drawer, the bottom one on the left side, had a small brass lock on it. I pulled at it gently, expecting resistance. But the lock gave way immediately, as though it had been left open in haste. Inside was a stack of documents, and beneath them, a leather-bound journal with no title on the cover. I lifted it out carefully and opened it to the first page. Kasper's handwriting. I recognized it instantly, the sharp slant of his letters, the way he looped his G's and crossed his T's with a slight upward flick. The first entry was dated nearly 6 years ago, 2 years before he and I had even met. It began with a name, Maren. He wrote about her the way a man writes about someone he loves when no one is watching. Raw, unfiltered. Without the polished restraint he showed the rest of the world. Maren was a woman he had met during a private visit to another European country. Their relationship had been brief but intense, and according to the journal, it had resulted in a pregnancy. A boy, born in the spring, 3.5 pounds. Premature but healthy. Kasper described holding his son for the first time in a private hospital room with the curtains drawn and security posted outside the door. He wrote that the baby had his eyes and Maren's mouth, and that looking at him felt like looking at a part of himself he hadn't known existed. My hands were shaking so badly the pages blurred. I kept reading. Entry after entry detailed secret visits, financial arrangements, coded communication channels set up by palace lawyers to ensure that no paper trail could ever lead back to the royal family. The child had been given Maren's surname. He was being raised in a quiet town, far from the media, far from the public eye, in a house that Kasper had purchased through a network of anonymous trusts. And then I reached the entries written after our wedding. Kasper described the guilt of standing at the altar with me while knowing that his son existed. He wrote about the agony of watching me settle into palace life, so trusting, so open, so determined to make it work, while he carried a secret that could destroy everything. But the line that shattered me, the one that made me close the journal and press it against my chest like I was trying to stop my heart from falling out, was the one where he wrote about a meeting held 2 weeks before our engagement. A meeting attended by the king, the queen, Kasper's siblings, the chief palace advisor, and the royal family's private attorney. In that meeting, they had discussed what to do about Maren and the child, and the decision, unanimously agreed upon by every person in that room, was to bury it, keep it hidden, proceed with the engagement, proceed with the wedding. Let me walk down that aisle completely blind to the truth, because the monarchy's image mattered more than my dignity. I was not a person to them. I was a strategy, a carefully chosen narrative designed to modernize the family's public image. The girl from Africa who married a prince. The fairy tale that would distract the world from the rot festering behind the palace walls. I placed the journal back in the drawer exactly where I found it. I walked out of the study, closed the door behind me, and stood in the hallway with my back pressed against the cold stone wall. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. My body had gone completely numb, like it had decided that feeling anything at all in that moment would be too dangerous. I just stood there, breathing, where staring at the portrait of Kasper's grandfather hanging on the opposite wall, a man in a gold-trimmed uniform with cold blue eyes. And I thought to myself, this family has been keeping secrets for centuries. I was just the latest person they decided to keep one from. I didn't confront Kasper that night. I couldn't. My body was present, but my mind had left the building entirely, gone somewhere far away where the words I had read in that journal couldn't reach me. When he came home that evening, cheerful and talkative, telling me about some charity initiative the palace was launching, I nodded and smiled and responded in all the right places. But I was watching him the way you watch a stranger on a train, studying him, trying to reconcile the man sitting across from me, buttering his toast and laughing at something on his phone, with the man who had written those journal entries, the man who had held another woman's child and described it as the most profound moment of his life. The man who had sat in a room with his entire family and collectively decided that I didn't deserve to know the truth about the life I was marrying into. I excused myself early that night, told him I had a headache, and lay in bed staring at the ceiling until the sun came up. I didn't sleep for 3 days. On the 4th day, I broke. Not loudly, not dramatically. There was no throwing of vases or slamming of doors. I simply stopped functioning. I woke up that morning and could not get out of bed. My legs felt like they had been filled with wet cement. My chest was so tight I thought I was having a heart attack, and I actually pressed the emergency button beside the bed because I genuinely believed something was physically wrong with me. The palace doctor arrived within minutes, checked my vitals, shone a light in my eyes, date, and told me that my body was fine. He said it was likely stress-related, prescribed rest, and left. But my body was not fine. My body was doing what my mind refused to do. It was collapsing under the weight of a betrayal so enormous that no amount of willpower could hold it up anymore. I stayed in that bed for 3 days straight. The curtains remained drawn. Trays of food were brought to my door and taken away untouched. Kasper came in and out, sitting on the edge of the bed, rubbing my back, asking me what was wrong, telling me he was worried. And every time his hand touched my skin, I felt a wave of nausea so violent I had to clench my jaw to keep from being sick. I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to grab him by the collar and demand to know how he could lie beside me every night knowing what he knew. But I said nothing. Because the truth was, I wasn't just devastated by what he had done. I was devastated by what it meant about me, about my judgment, about every choice I had made since that night in Geneva. I had given up everything for this man, my career, my independence, my identity. I had walked away from a life I had built with my own hands, brick by painstaking brick, to become part of his world. And now I was learning that his world had never truly included me. I was an ornament, a headline, a brown-skinned girl in a tiara that made the monarchy look progressive and compassionate, while behind closed doors, they conspired to keep me blind and obedient. The realization didn't just hurt, it hollowed me out. I felt like someone had reached inside my chest and scooped out everything that made me who I was, so leaving behind nothing but a shell dressed in designer clothes and royal jewels. My mother knew something was wrong. She called me every day, and every day I could hear the worry tightening her voice like a rope being pulled taut. She asked me if I was eating. I lied and said yes. She asked me if Kasper was treating me well. I lied and said of course. She asked me if I was happy, and for the first time, I couldn't lie. I just went silent. And my mother, who had spent her entire life reading the things her daughter didn't say, whispered into the phone, "Amara, whatever it is, you are still the girl who walked out of this village with fire in her bones. Don't you dare let anyone put that fire out." I hung up the phone and cried for the first time since finding the journal. Not the quiet, dignified kind of crying. The kind that comes from somewhere primal, somewhere deep in the belly. The kind that bends you in half and steals your breath and leaves you gasping on the floor like a fish pulled from water. I cried for the girl who believed that love could be simple and honest. I cried for the woman who had stood at that altar radiating joy while an entire family watched her, knowing she was walking into a lie. And I cried for my parents who had sacrificed everything to give me a chance at a better life, only for that life to deliver me into the hands of people who saw me as nothing more than a convenient story. The weeks that followed were the darkest of my life. I stopped attending public engagements. The palace issued statements saying I was recovering from a minor illness. Kasper grew more anxious with each passing day, hovering around me like a man watching a building crack, knowing it's about to come down but unable to do anything to stop it. His mother, the Queen, visited my quarters once. She sat in the chair across from my bed, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable, and told me that the family was concerned about my well-being. She said the public was beginning to ask questions, and that it was important for me to resume my duties as soon as possible. She never once asked me what was wrong. She never once looked at me with genuine concern. She looked at me the way a director looks at an actress who has forgotten her lines and is holding up the entire production. I stared at her, this woman who had kissed my cheeks and called me daughter, who had known about Maureen and the child long before I ever set foot in her palace. No, and I felt something new rising in my chest. Not sadness, not despair. Something hotter, something sharper. It was anger. The kind of anger that doesn't burn wild and reckless, but instead settles into your bones like molten steel, hardening you from the inside out. I looked the Queen directly in the eyes and said, "I will return to my duties when I am ready, Your Majesty, not a moment before." She blinked. It was the first time I had ever seen her caught off guard. She stood, smoothed her skirt, and left without another word. And as I watched her walk out of my room, I realized something that both terrified and liberated me. I was no longer afraid of this family, and a woman who is no longer afraid is the most dangerous thing a kingdom built on secrets can face. I spent the next 2 weeks planning in silence. Not the frantic, emotional kind of planning driven by rage and impulse, but the careful, methodical kind that comes from a woman who spent years studying international law and understands that when you go up against powerful people, you don't move until every piece is in place. I started small. I began keeping a record of everything: dates, times, conversations, interactions. Every sideways glance from the Queen, every abruptly ended phone call from Kasper, every door that was closed before I could enter. I wrote it all down in a notebook I kept hidden inside the lining of a coat in the back of my wardrobe. A coat I knew no one would touch because it was the old wool one I had brought from London. The one the palace stylist had politely suggested I donate because it didn't align with my new image. I also started paying closer attention to the palace's internal rhythms, the schedules of the staff, the patterns of the security rotations, the days when Kasper's private study was left unattended. I wasn't reckless. I was surgical, because I knew that the moment this family sensed I was a threat, they would close ranks around me so tightly I would never find my way out. On a Thursday afternoon, while Kasper was away on an official visit to a neighboring country, and the Queen was occupied with a luncheon on the east wing of the palace, I returned to the study. My hands were steadier this time. My breathing was controlled. I opened the bottom drawer, retrieved the journal, and this time I didn't just read it, so I photographed every single page. 67 pages in total. Names, dates, financial records, references to legal agreements, details about the trust funds set up to conceal payments to Marin, and most importantly, the entry describing the family meeting where the unanimous decision was made to hide the truth from me before the wedding. I put the journal back exactly as I found it. checked that the drawer looked undisturbed, and left the study with my phone tucked inside my coat pocket. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth, but my face was calm. I had spent months learning to wear a mask in this palace. Now that mask was the only thing protecting me. That evening, I made a phone call I never thought I would make. I called my old colleague from the law firm in London, a woman named Priya, who had become one of my closest friends during my years in the city. Priya was the kind of lawyer who made powerful men nervous. She was sharp, relentless, and had an instinct for strategy that I had always admired. When she answered the phone and heard my voice, there was a pause, and then she said, "Amara, what's happened?" She knew. Before I even said a word, she knew, because Priya had always been able to read me better than anyone except my mother. I told her everything: the journal, the secret child, the family meeting, the months of deception, the Queen's cold visit to my bedside. Priya listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a long silence, and then she said, "Amara, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You are not just a wife in a marriage. You are a foreign national inside an institution that operates like a sovereign state. If you confront them without protection, they will bury you the same way they buried that child's existence. You need legal counsel, you need documentation, and you need an exit strategy." I told her I already had the documentation. She went quiet again and then said, "Good. Then we need to talk about what you want. Do you want to save the marriage, or do you want to survive it?" I closed my eyes and pressed the phone hard against my ear. It was the question I had been running from for weeks, because part of me, the part that still remembered how Kasper looked at me across that table in Geneva, the part that still heard his voice cracking when he told me who he really was on the South Bank, that part wanted to believe this could be repaired. But the other part of me, the part that had read those 67 pages, the part that had watched an entire family smile in my face while they conspired behind my back, that part already knew the answer. I told Priya I wanted to survive it. Over the following days, Priya and I built a plan. She connected me with a discreet legal team in London that specialized in high-profile international cases. Everything was communicated through encrypted channels. Nothing was written down on paper. Nothing was discussed inside the palace. I conducted every call during my morning walks in the palace gardens, the one time of day when I was allowed to be alone without staff hovering nearby. And even then, I kept my voice low and my eyes moving, scanning the tree lines and pathways for anyone who might be watching. I was living two lives. The public one, where I had resumed my royal duties, attending engagements and smiling for cameras, with a composure that would have impressed even the Queen herself. And the private one, where I was quietly assembling the evidence I would need when the time came to walk away from the most powerful family I had ever known. Kasper noticed something had changed. He didn't know what, but he could feel it. I saw it in the way he watched me when he thought I wasn't looking. His brow furrowed, his lips slightly parted, as though he was trying to read a language he didn't speak. One night, he reached for me in bed, and I let him hold me, but I kept my eyes open, staring into the darkness over his shoulder. He whispered, "I love you, Amara. You know that, don't you?" I said I knew. But what I didn't say, what I couldn't say, was that love without truth is just a beautiful lie, and I had spent my whole life being too honest to live inside one. He fell asleep with his arm around me, and I lay there listening to him breathe, counting the beats between each exhale, memorizing the sound, because somewhere deep inside me, I understood that the woman lying in that bed tonight and the woman who would wake up in the weeks to come were not going to be the same person. Everything was in place. The legal team was ready. The evidence was secured. The exit strategy had been mapped down to the hour. All that was left was the hardest part, the confrontation, the moment I would look my husband in the eye and let him know that I had found the journal, that I knew about Marin and the child, that I knew about the family meeting, and that I was no longer the naive girl from Makueni County who could be managed and kept in the dark. I had chosen a date, a specific evening, 3 days away, when Kasper and I would be alone in the palace with no engagements, no staff dinners, no obligations. Just us and the truth that had been rotting between us since before I ever said, "I do." But what I didn't know, what I couldn't have possibly predicted, was that Kasper already knew. He had found the photographs missing from his phone's cloud backup. He had noticed the slight displacement of the journal in the drawer. And 2 days before my planned confrontation, I came home from a garden walk to find him sitting in the living room, the journal open on the table in front of him, his face pale as chalk, and standing beside him, Wei, with her arms folded and her jaw set like a woman preparing for war, was the queen. The room was silent. Kasper looked up at me, and in his eyes I saw something I had never seen before. It wasn't guilt, it wasn't anger, it was fear. And not fear of losing me, fear of what I was about to do to them. I stood in the doorway, my coat still on, my phone still in my pocket, and I looked at the two of them sitting there like judges in a courtroom they had built to try me. And for the first time in months, I smiled. Not because I was happy, but because they had just made the worst mistake a powerful family can make. They had shown me their hand before I had shown mine. What happened next in that room would determine not just the future of my marriage, but the future of an entire monarchy. And nothing, not the crown, not the title, not the centuries of tradition that family clung to like armor, could have prepared them for what I was about to say.